Madam President, we are dealing with a very disturbing crisis on our borders. It's unbelievable the situation that has developed and how rapidly it's developed, but it has indeed been building up for more than a year. It's a direct result and predictable result of the President's policies of not enforcing the laws of the United States when it comes to immigration. It's a very sad day, and it can only end when the President stops suspending laws and starts enforcing laws. The President is a chief law enforcement officer in America. Every Border Patrol officer, every ICE officer, every Coast Guard officer, every military officer, every Department of Justice employee, FBI employee, work for him. He supervises them and directs them. He has been directing them not to enforce rather than to enforce the law. The evidence of that is undeniable. The law officers, the ICE officers, the Immigration Customs Enforcement officers sued their supervisor, directly appointed by President Obama, for blocking them from fulfilling their oath to enforce the laws of the United States of America. And this federal court case is still ongoing. And the judge has found, at least at one point in his order, that the President has no right to direct officers not to comply with the law. And we now know that we are facing an exceedingly grave threat of an unbelievable expansion of his unilateral executive orders of amnesty. They go beyond anything we've ever seen in this country and threatens the very constitutional framework of our republic and the very ability of this nation to even have borders, it seems to me, and certainly to create a lawful, equitable, consistent enforcement in our country. The respected newspaper, National Journal, that's here in Washington. It's a nonpartisan, respected paper. Reported this just, I believe, well, July 3rd, quote, and a lot of people have missed this, and we need to know what this is saying, and we need to know what it means, and we need, as members of Congress and this Senate, to resist it, and we cannot allow it to happen. We will not allow it to happen. American people, when they find out what's being discussed, will not allow it to happen, in my opinion. And Congress needs to be directed by the people, I hate to say, to resist. Here's what it says. Obama made it clear he would press his executive powers to the limit. He gave quiet credence to recommendations from La Raza and other immigration groups that between 5 million to 6 million adult illegal immigrants could be spared deportation under a similar form of deferred adjudication he ordered for the so-called Dreamers in June of 2012. The Dreamers being the young people. 5 to 6 million would be given legal status in the United States of America when they've entered contrary to law, are in the country contrary to law, and are not entitled to work in America. The article goes on to say, Obama has now ordered the Homeland Security and Justice Departments to find executive authorities that could enlarge that non-prosecutorial umbrella by a factor of 10. Senior officials also tell me Obama wants to see what he can do with executive power to provide temporary legal status to undocumented adults. What we know is with the children's group, they were provided with an ID card that at the top of it in big print says, Employee Authorization Card. And this is exactly what's being talked about here, that the President of the United States is saying this. Now remember, the United States Congress has been asked by activist groups and certain business interests to provide an amnesty for people that are here. And the United States Congress has declined to do so. It has been fully and openly debated and has not passed into law. That's the decision of the United States Congress. That's the decision that we have made, the duly elected body that passes laws. And as such, they not having been given amnesty, the President of the United States is not entitled to do so. By declaration of duly passed law, people aren't entitled to come to America unlawfully, come to America and stay unlawfully. They are not entitled to do that. How simple is this? And they're not entitled to be able to take jobs if they do. They're not entitled to certain government benefits if they come illegally. Of course they're not. Of course they're not able to work and take jobs and get benefits if they came to the country illegally. So, when this first got talked about in more general terms, 22 members of the United States Senate wrote President Obama and questioned what we're hearing. And the senators wrote this: these policies that you've done have operated as an effective repeal of duly enacted federal immigration law and exceeds the bounds of the President's prosecutorial discretion. It is not the province of the executive to nullify laws that the people of the United States, through their elected representatives, have chosen to enact. To the contrary, it is the duty of the executive to take care that these laws are faithfully executed. Congress has not passed laws permitting people to illegally enter the country or to ignore their visa expiration dates, so long as they do not have a felony conviction or other severe offenses on the record. Your actions demonstrate an astonishing disregard for the Constitution, the rule of law, and the rights of American citizens and legal residents. Our entire constitutional system, the letter goes on to say, is threatened when the executive branch suspends the law at its whim, and our nation's sovereignty is imperiled when the commander-in-chief refuses to defend the integrity of its borders. You swore an oath, the letter says to the President, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. We therefore ask you to uphold that oath and carry out the duties required by the Constitution and entrusted to you by the American people. The President is limited. He's not all-powerful. He's been entrusted with certain limited powers by the people of the United States of America. And now we understand he intends to go even further. And the response we got back never really addressed it at all, except from his Secretary of Homeland Security, Mr. Jay Johnson. He announced that, yes, he is indeed, at the order of the President of the United States, conducting a review of how many other people he could provide this amnesty for and work authorization for. So, last week, one of our able colleagues, Senator Ted Cruz, former Solicitor General for the Attorney General's office in Texas, who argues cases in the appellate courts of the country, Senator Cruz identified this problem and proposed, Senator Cruz, I think, a legislative fix that every member of this body should sign. Some may say, well, the President, I don't think he's going to do this. Okay, why not bar him from doing it? Some say, I don't think we should sign it. Well, why not? He's basically said it. He's already done it with the younger group, and he says it's going to be a tenfold increase in the 5 to 6 million people that is suggested to be legalized by the President's unilateral executive order represents about 10 times the number of people who've already been given lawful status in effect by the President's unlawful executive order. Senator Cruz, maybe it would be appropriate, and I would appreciate it, if you would explain your analysis of this issue and how your legislation would be effective in ensuring that we don't go down this illegal road any further.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I thank my friend, the junior senator from Alabama, for his very kind comments and for his relentless leadership in defense of rule of law and standing against amnesty. And what I'd like to speak about this afternoon are the humanitarian crisis that is playing out on our southern border right now and the abdication of responsibility that is playing out in Washington, D.C. A couple of weeks ago, President Obama was down in my home state of Texas. He found time to go to 2 Democratic Party fundraisers, to pal around with some Democratic Party fat cats, to collect a whole bunch of checks, and yet somehow he didn't have time to make it down to our southern border. The day before he was in Colorado, he found time to play a game of pool with the governor there. I'm glad he enjoyed himself playing pool. Yet somehow he didn't have time to go visit Lackland Air Force Base and see the 1,200 children that are being held there who are paying the price for the failure of the Obama immigration policy. In coming weeks, he's headed to Martha's Vineyard. He's, I'm sure, going to enjoy himself palling around with swills, and yet the people held in detention facilities up and down the border are not going to see the commander-in-chief because he cannot be bothered to address the human suffering. He was just in California, in Hollywood. The producer of Scandal hosted him. You know, that's kind of fitting, because it is scandalous that the president has more time to be fundraiser-in-chief than he does to do his basic job as commander-in-chief in securing our borders. Well, let me tell you, while the president was running around collecting checks from Democratic Party fat cats, I was back home in Texas. I was on the border this weekend down in McAllen. I sat down with the chief of the Border Patrol in McAllen. I sat down with the line officers in the Border Patrol in McAllen. I visited the detention facilities that are being constructed to hold these children. You know, I saw a remarkable facility. Used to be a gigantic warehouse. And in 18 days, Border Patrol had to stand up a facility to house 1,000 children, because that's the volume that's coming through there every couple of days. You know, the president is right in one regard. He has publicly stated we're seeing a humanitarian crisis. And that is correct, but it is a crisis of his own creation. This humanitarian crisis is the direct consequence of President Obama's lawlessness. And I will note, he cannot even be bothered to cast his eyes on the people who are suffering because of it. If you want to know what's causing this crisis, a simple examination of the numbers will suffice. Just 3 years ago, in 2011, the number of unaccompanied children entering this country was roughly 6,000. Then in 2012, in June of 2012, just a few months before the election, President Obama unilaterally granted amnesty to some 800,000 people who were here illegally in this country who entered as children. Now, he did so presumably because he thought there'd be a political benefit. It was a few months before an election, and he thought there was good politics in ignoring the law and granting amnesty. But the foreseeable consequence of that amnesty, the predictable and the predicted consequence of that amnesty, if you tell people across the globe, if you enter as children, you get amnesty, suddenly you create an incredible incentive for more and more children to come and more children to come alone. This year, the Department of Homeland Security estimates that 90,000 unaccompanied children will enter this country illegally. Next year, they estimate 145,000. Mr. President, I want you to compare those numbers for a second. 3 years ago, it was 6,000. Now it's 90,000. Next year, 145,000. The direct and proximate cause was President Obama's amnesty. Now, there are some in this body that might not believe what a member of the opposite party says on this. There's a whole lot of partisanship in Washington. It really has shut down the ability of this body to deal with real challenges facing this country. Well, if you don't believe what a member of the opposite party says, perhaps you will believe the Border Patrol. Just a few weeks ago, the Border Patrol conducted a confidential study that was given to members of the Senate Judiciary Committee by a whistleblower in the Border Patrol, where they interviewed over 200 people who had entered the country recently illegally. And they asked them the question, why are you coming? 95% said, we're coming because we believe we'll get amnesty. We believe we will get a permiso, that if we just get here, we'll be allowed to stay. Now, the administration's been giving lots of supposed causes for this humanitarian crisis. One of their favorites is the violence in Central America, and it's true. Tragically, there is a great deal of violence in Central America, and it has been increasing. But I would note, violence is not new to the human condition. There have always been countries across the globe that are racked by violence, racked by civil war, and we've always seen when violence rises, the immigration from a particular country go up. We see legal immigration from that country go up. We see illegal immigration from that country go up. What we haven't seen in the past is the explosion of children. The violence in Central America is a reasonable cause to explain the increase in immigrants from Central America, the increase in families coming up to get away from the violence. What it doesn't explain is this new phenomenon, 90,000 unaccompanied children. That's a new phenomenon. There's no reason violence would say, I'm going to take my little boy, I'm going to take my little girl and send them alone. That instead is a direct response to what President Obama did, granting amnesty. That was targeted to those who entered as kids. Why are kids entering? Because the president has said, if you enter as a kid, I will grant you amnesty. Several weeks ago, I visited Lackland Air Force Base, where roughly 1,200 of these children are being held. I visited with the senior officials there. And it's worth understanding that there are many victims of the president's refusal to enforce the law, but some of the most direct victims are these little boys and little girls. Because the coyotes that are bringing these children in, they're not well-meaning social workers. They don't have beards and Birkenstocks, and they're not there out of love. These coyotes are hardened, vicious, transnational drug cartels. And these children are being subjected to horrific physical abuse and sexual abuse. When I was at Lackland Air Force Base, a senior official there described to me how these coyotes, they get custody of these kids to smuggle them illegally into this country. And then sometimes they'll decide to hold the children for ransom, to get even more money from the families. And if the families cannot or will not pay, horribly, what these coyotes are doing is severing body parts of these children and sending them back to the families. The senior official at Lackland described coyotes putting machine guns to the back of the head of a little boy or a little girl and ordering them to cut off the fingers or the ears of another little boy or little girl. And if the child refuses, they shoot that child and move on to the next one. And they described how on our end, we're seeing children come into this country, some of whom have been horribly maimed by these violent coyotes and drug cartels, other of whom have enormous psychological damage from a little boy or a little girl forced to commit such atrocities upon pain of death. I asked the officials at Lackland, how many of these children have been victimized? The answer, all of them. That was from the senior official at Lackland. By the way, one of the things we hear reports of is these families with the girls, before they send them up, They give them birth control because the expectations are that the risks of sexual assault and rape are so high. And that risk is being undertaken because of the promise of amnesty. When I was down in McAllen this weekend, I asked the line agents, I said, listen, you guys every day, you're on the river, you're in the helicopter, you're securing the border. Why are they coming? What's changed? Just 3 years ago, it was 6,000 kids. Now it's 90,000. What has changed? Every single one of the Border Patrol agents gave the exact same answer. They said they're coming because they believe they will get amnesty. It's important to understand, by the way, the coyotes smuggle them across the border. And as soon as they get across the border, they actively look for the Border Patrol. They're not being captured. They're not being caught. They go look for someone in uniform, and they may have ragged clothes falling off their back. They may not have food or water, but they have their papers. They have their papers with them. They cross the border illegally with the coyote. They endure the physical and sexual abuse. And then they look for the Border Patrol to hand their papers. Why? Because they believe once they get here and hand their papers over, they get amnesty. Mr. President, if we want to solve this crisis, there is one and only one way to solve this crisis, and that is to eliminate the promise of amnesty. I mentioned a few moments ago that I wanted to talk about this humanitarian crisis and talk about the abdication of responsibility. Because Washington has always been lousy at taking responsibility for the suffering our policies create. But the response of this president, and I'm sorry to say the Democratic majority in this body, has been particularly callous. President Obama proposed a $3.7 billion supplemental plan. Mind you, he didn't have time to visit the border, to visit the children, to see the suffering, but he proposed yet more spending. Now, the $3.7 billion supplemental is an HHS social services bill. It spend a whole bunch of money. And by the way, to give you a sense of just how much $3.7 billion is, for $3.7 billion, we could purchase a first-class airplane ticket for each one of these 90,000 children to return them home. First class, sitting in the front row of a commercial airline. And after doing so, we could deposit $3.6 billion back in the federal treasury. It's a massive amount of money he's asked for, and what's striking? Less than 5% of it goes to border security. Mr. President, here's the cynical part. Here's the sad part. Nothing in the president's proposal does anything to solve the underlying problem. Nothing does anything to eliminate the promise of amnesty. Nothing does anything to solve the problem. So what the president is saying is he's perfectly content for this crisis to continue in perpetuity. Under the president's bill, next year we can expect the 145,000 DHS expects to come. We can expect tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of little boys and little girls to be physically assaulted and sexually assaulted by coyotes. Mr. President, that's not humane. That's not compassionate. Any system that continues to have children in the custody of these vicious drug cartels is the very opposite of humane and compassionate. And as my friend, the junior senator from Alabama, pointed out, the magnet of amnesty has been significantly exacerbated in recent months. Why? Because President Obama, in a very high-profile way, met with far-left activists and made a promise. He said, I'm going to study how to expand amnesty and to grant amnesty to another 5 or 6 million people here illegally. Now, let's be clear, there is nothing, zero in U.S. immigration law that gives the president the power to grant amnesty. It is open lawlessness and contempt for rule of law. But yet that promise is heard. That promise is heard throughout Central America, that promise is heard by those mothers and dads who make the heart-wrenching decision to hand their sons and daughters over to these coyotes. Now, they do so because they love their kids and they believe, as terrible as the journey will be, that if they get here, they get a permiso, they get to stay in the promised land. That promise of amnesty is why this crisis is happening. So I've introduced legislation to solve the problem. Last week, I introduced a very simple bill that puts into law that President Obama has no authority to grant any additional amnesty. It's a very simple bill. It prevents the president taking the DACA program that he unilaterally and illegally implemented in 2012 and expanding it to cover any new immigrants. Now, it's interesting. Representatives from the administration go on television and they say, these children are not eligible for amnesty. Well, if that's their position, the administration should support my bill. If that's their position, all this bill does is put into law what they say their position is, that these children are not eligible for amnesty. Well, have they supported the bill? They have not. Instead, the majority leader of this body took it upon himself to go out and hold a press conference. And what is the top priority for the majority leader of this body? To come after and attack the legislation I introduced. To personally come after freshman senator from Texas. Well, the majority leader is welcome to impugn any member of this body. Sadly, that happens all too often. But yet nowhere in the majority leader's comments was a word said about solving this problem. Nowhere in the majority leader's comments were a word said about changing it so little boys and little girls are not physically and sexually assaulted, so we don't have tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of kids coming illegally into this country. Look, we all understand politics in this town. It's an election year. The election's a few years away. Scaring people and demagoguing, unfortunately, is not new to Washington. But the cynicism that is reflected in President Obama and majority leaders' approach to this issue is a new level for this town. This week, I'm introducing broader legislation that not only includes what was included last week, a prohibition on the president granting amnesty, but includes two other elements. A reform of the 2008 law to expedite the humane return of these children to their families, and a provision to reimburse the cost for the states calling up the National Guard to secure their borders. Now, Mr. President, I'd like to say a word about the 2008 law. That's actually been discussed a lot in this body. And indeed, the Obama administration has two talking points. If you ask the administration what's caused this crisis, the first one is violence in Central America. Now, there's something convenient about that talking point, because if it's violence in Central America, it's not President Obama's fault. It's not anything they've done. It's something else extrinsic. But the second talking point that sometimes the administration will say is that the cause of this crisis is the 2008 law. Now, Mr. President, there's a reason they point to that, because it seems there is nothing that President Obama enjoys more than blaming everything bad on this planet on George W. Bush. The 2008 law was signed by George W. Bush. So if this crisis was caused by the 2008 law, then mirabile dictu, it's not this administration's fault. But John Adams famously said, facts are stubborn things. If you're going to make a claim that a crisis is caused by the 2008 law, you have to be willing to take at least a moment to look to the facts. The 2008 law was passed, unsurprisingly, in 2008. The number of children entering unaccompanied did not spike in 2008. It didn't spike in 2009. It didn't spike in 2010. It didn't spike in 2011. 2011, it was roughly 6,000. If the 2008 law were the cause of this crisis, we would have seen the numbers spike in 08 or 9 or 10 or 11. Now, they didn't spike until 2012, June of 2012, when the president pulled out his pen and granted amnesty. That is the cause, the direct cause, the cause that the Border Patrol tells us these immigrants are telling us is why they're coming. Now, once the crisis was created, the 2008 law has had unintended consequences. The 2008 law allowed expedited removal for unaccompanied children from Mexico and Canada, or immediately contiguous countries, but created slow, delayed, bureaucratized removal for children from more distant countries. That didn't create significant problems in 08 or 09 or 10 or 11 because we didn't have a massive influx of kids from those countries. But once the president illegally granted amnesty, and we started getting, as we are expected to this year, 90,000 unaccompanied children, most of whom are from Central American countries, now we're seeing the 2008 law cause real problems because returning these children home is delayed, often delayed indefinitely. You know, when I was in McAllen meeting with the line Border Patrol agents, I asked them another question. I said, listen, Washington is dysfunctional. Partisan politics rips the town apart. If you could ignore the politics, what do you say on the front lines? How do we actually secure the borders? How do we solve this problem? Every single one of the Border Patrol agents answered the same way. They said, we have to send them home. We treat them humanely, we treat them compassionately, because that's who we are as Americans. Those are our values. But humanely and compassionately, we need to expeditiously return them to their families back home. Why? Because if the children are allowed to stay, and mark my words, President Obama wants these children to stay, and he wants to grant amnesty to the next children and the next children, which means that promise of amnesty will cause tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of children to continue to be physically assaulted and sexually assaulted in perpetuity. If you grant amnesty, all it will do is incite yet more kids to be victimized. The only way to solve this problem, this is coming from the Border Patrol agents, is to humanely and expeditiously send them home, reunite them with their families. The legislation I'm introducing this week changes the 2008 law so that the policies for sending them home are the same as the policies for Mexico and Canada. We treat Mexico and Canada with great friendship and compassion. There's no reason why the very same procedures cannot apply to children from Central America. And the final element of this bill is dealing to the real security crisis that is occurring. You know, just today, the junior senator from Alabama and I both heard a briefing from one of our senior military leaders on the national security threats caused by our porous borders, by the same avenues that are taking these kids in that are also being used to smuggle vast quantities of drugs. The same corridors that are taking these kids in are also being used to smuggle in thousands of aliens from special interest countries. In the Middle East, aliens from countries that face serious issues of radical Islamic terrorism. And a number of our border governors have stepped forward to respond to this crisis. I commend the governor of my home state of Texas, Rick Perry, for showing leadership, calling up the National Guard in Texas. It was the right thing to do. He shouldn't have to do it. Constitution gives that responsibility to the federal government. The governor shouldn't have to step in and fill the breach, and they're doing so because the president and the federal government are refusing to do their job. but I commend the governors for doing so, and the legislation I'm introducing simply provides that when the state steps up and does the job that is our responsibility, that the federal government will reimburse the costs. Mr. President, in all likelihood next week, we're going to have a vote on a bill that is denominated a border security bill. It's a bill the majority leader wants us to vote on that is a version of the president's HHS social services bill. Spends a whole bunch of money and does nothing, zero, nada, to solve the problem. Majority leader knows that. The president knows that. And the intention is to have it voted down. You know, one of the incredible things about where we are right now is this Democratic Senate is a do-nothing Senate. Mr. President, we don't pass any legislation of consequence. And there's a reason for that. The majority leader has decided we're not going to pass any legislation of consequence. So instead, what do we have? We have a series of show votes, every one of which is designed to fail, every one of which the majority leader knows will fail, and every one of which is poll tested or focus group tested to allow Democrats running for re-election to campaign based on those votes. But it's not legislating. It's not doing the job the Senate was meant to do. This border security bill that we'll likely vote on next week will do nothing for border security. It's not designed to. Even if it were to pass, it's not designed to. It's not designed to do anything to stop President Obama's amnesty. It's not designed to do anything to expedite reuniting these kids with their families back home. It's simply designed to be a fig leaf to say the Democrats have responded to this crisis and the evil, mean, nasty Republicans didn't go along. Now, look, that's a political narrative that is not new. It's common in partisan politics. It just happens not to be true. Unfortunately, the Democratic majority in this body has demonstrated no interest in actually solving this problem. And you want to know just how cynical the majority leader's strategy is? They have added to this border bill a provision that would replenish the Iron Dome missiles for the nation of Israel. Now, I would note that has nothing to do with the crisis at our southern border. It is a policy that is unambiguously good. Every member on the Republican side of this chamber supports replenishing the Iron Dome missiles that are right now keeping Israel safe from the Hamas terrorist rocket fire. So why has the majority leader stuck that onto a bill that he knows will fail and is designed to fail? Well, it's called partisan politics. Because when it fails, the talking points will come out, the majority leader will come out and say, the Republicans don't want to solve the problem on the border, and the Republicans are unwilling to stand with our friend and ally Israel. Let me tell you right now, every Republican on this side of the chamber would vote right now, this afternoon, to replenish the Iron Dome missiles. And to be honest, we should be voting. You know, in most parts of the country, Thursday afternoon, 4:30, people who actually have an honest job are still at work. Not in the United States Senate. United States Senate people head on home. People are out campaigning. How about we actually have senators show up on this floor, more than one or two at a time, and debate these issues? How about we actually see senators stand up, debate the issues, and resolve the problems? The majority leader went on television and said, the border is secure. Mr. President, I find that an astonishing assertion. I recognize how, from the perch of Washington, D.C., it might seem that way. Perhaps the D.C.-Virginia border is secure. But I would invite the majority leader, and I would invite any member of this chamber, come down to Texas, come to McAllen, come visit the border. When I was in McAllen on Saturday, the Border Patrol agents told me the day before they had apprehended 622 people. I went to the processing center. They had 10 holding centers with 700 people there. One holding room had little girls below age 14 unaccompanied. Another holding room had little boys under age 14 unaccompanied. A third holding room had girls age 14 to 19 unaccompanied. The fourth room had boys age 14 to 19 unaccompanied. The fifth and sixth rooms had family units, mothers and fathers and little bitty babies, including tiny infants needing diapers and formulas. And then the final four holding areas held adults. That was one day. That wasn't a week. That wasn't a month. That was one day. 90,000 children, unaccompanied children, are expected to enter the country this year. And the majority leader of the U.S. Senate says the border is secure. I would invite the majority leader to say that to those little boys and little girls who've just been victimized, that the border's secure. That sure would surprise them. I would invite the majority leader to say that to the farmers and ranchers and the citizens in South Texas, because that sure would surprise them. And by the way, if you get outside of Washington, this issue isn't partisan. When you go down to South Texas and you visit with the elected leaders there, most of whom, are elected Democrats and often Hispanic Democrats. And you ask, what's your top priority among Hispanic Democrats on the border? They say border security. Because the border is so far from secure, their communities are paying the price. I'd invite the majority leader to come to Brooks County, Texas. Brooks County, Texas. Hundreds of men, women, and children are found dead from crossing illegally. I'd invite the majority leader to look, as I have, at the photographs of these bodies, pregnant women abandoned and left to die. These are vicious cartels and coyotes. Mr. President, this is the face of Amnesty. 90,000 children being victimized, being physically assaulted and sexually assaulted. This is the face of Amnesty. Children held in detention centers with chain link fences going up 18 feet, separating them in separate pens. This is the face of Amnesty. Our heart breaks for these kids. But if it really breaks for these kids, we should do something about it. The only way to stop this humanitarian crisis is to stop President Obama's amnesty. As long as the president continues to promise amnesty, these children will keep coming and they'll keep being victimized. And sadly, as long as Senate Democrats are unwilling to stand up to their president and say, let's actually show some leadership to fix this problem, then the Senate will continue to be the Democratic do-nothing Senate. We won't solve these problems, and we will fail in the fundamental obligation all of us owe to the men and women who elected us. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
The senator from Alabama.
I would just thank the senator from Texas, because it indeed is the face of Amnesty, and he has documented for us, I think indisputably, that this surge of immigration was a result of the amnesty provided for these children by the President of the United States. I think that's all been known, but I think we've never had a clearer analysis of it. Senator Cruz, the president, I'm reading now further in the National Journal article about what the president's planning to do next. The concern we have about the future. I'm not making this up, colleagues. This is a very real action that the president is considering, as I read from that chart on amnesty, that he would execute contrary to law that would give legal status and work status to 5 to 6 million people, 10 times the number that he's been provided in this action. And what did National Journal report? Well, I'm quoting here, quote, "The president also told the group," this is a group of La Raza and other activist groups that are demanding amnesty and really open borders. He told them that Boehner, the Speaker of the House, urged him not to press ahead with executive action because that would make legislating more difficult next year. In other words, Speaker Boehner says, don't use this executive amnesty in the future, Mr. President. So now the president's talking to the group, Senator Cruz, these activists that have been pushing him and demanding things, and this is what the article says, quote, "Obama told the group, according to those present, apparently more than one told the reporter this, his response to Boehner was, quote, 'Sorry about that. I'm going to keep my promise and move forward with executive action soon,' close quote." Makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck as a former federal prosecutor in federal court for almost 15 years to have the president do this. And he went on to say, the article does, in the room there was something of a collective electric gasp. The assembled immigration rights groups had been leaning hard on Obama for months to use executive action to sidestep Congress and privately mocked what they regarded as Pollyanna hopes that House Republicans would budge. Obama told the groups that what they had been dying to hear, that he was going to condemn House Republicans for inaction and provide legal status to millions of undocumented workers all by himself.
Would the senator yield for a question?
I would be pleased.
The junior senator from Alabama has just described President Obama's stated intention to grant amnesty to an additional 5 to 6 million people here illegally in the months preceding this next election. So the junior senator from Alabama is certainly aware. There are a number of senators up for re-election, including a number of Democrats in bright red states where the constituents of those states, whether in Louisiana or Arkansas or North Carolina or many other states, don't support amnesty for another 5 or 6 million people here illegally. And the question I would ask my friend from Alabama, is he aware of any Democrat in this chamber, including those Democrats running for re-election in conservative states where the citizens strongly oppose amnesty? Is he aware of any Democrat in this chamber who's had the courage to stand with him in standing up to President Obama and saying, do not grant amnesty illegally? Is he aware of any Democrat who has joined the two of us in our legislation to prohibit President Obama from illegally granting amnesty to 5 to 6 million people?
Well, I don't. And one of the things that I think the American people do need to understand, that when Majority Leader Reid, in conjunction with the President of the United States, blocks even amendments up for a vote, where does he get his power, Senator Cruz? He gets his power from every member of his conference. And none of them are breaking in that and saying this is not right. And Senator Cruz, your amendment would deal with this future danger, that the president might do this again. I think, and we've looked at it hard, my judiciary staff, we both serve on that committee, have said that this would actually work to ensure that we don't have another rogue action, unlawful, by the President of the United States, directly contrary to the decided will of the American people and congressional action. So the president's not happy that Congress doesn't pass his law, and he says they won't act, so I will. But colleagues, when we don't act, we act. That is an act. It's a decision, as sure as if we'd passed a law. A decision not to act is a decision. The President of the United States can't simply go around and say, I can do anything I want because Congress won't act. How ridiculous is that? So, National Journal article calls this policy explosive. And I believe that's a direct action. And one more thing, Senator Cruz, I know you are a student of the Constitution, and Professor Turley at George Washington University has testified numerous times before Congress. I think he considers himself a Democrat, a liberal, but he is deeply concerned of the future of our republic because of the president's overreach and exceeding the lawful powers given to the president. Is some other president going to expand it further, and pretty soon Congress becomes nothing? So I'd ask you, maybe if you share this concern, because you were very active as a top lawyer in the Attorney General's office in Texas in litigating these kind of issues. So this is what Professor Turley says. The president's pledge to effectively govern alone is alarming. And what is most alarming is his ability to fulfill that pledge. When a president can govern alone, he becomes a government unto himself, which is precisely the danger the framers sought to avoid. Professor Turley goes on, quote, "What we're witnessing today is one of the greatest crises that members of this body will face. It has reached a constitutional tipping point that threatens a fundamental change in how our country is governed," close quote. Senator Cruz, does that cause you concern, and do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, Senator Sessions, it causes me great concern. And one of the most troubling aspects of the Obama presidency has been the persistent pattern of lawlessness from this president. We have never seen a president who, if he disagrees with a particular law, so frequently and so brazenly refuses to enforce it, refuses to comply with it, and asserts the power to unilaterally change it. The president famously said, "I have a pen and I have a phone." And he seems to confuse his pen and his phone for the constitutional process of lawmaking that our country was built on. Rule of law does not mean you have a country with a whole lot of laws. Most countries have laws, and many totalitarian countries have a whole lot of laws. Rule of law means that no man is above the law. It means that everyone, and especially the president, is bound by the law. President Obama openly defies his constitutional obligation under Article 2 of the Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. I would note Professor Turley, whom the junior senator from Alabama quoted. He is a liberal Democrat who in 2008 voted for President Obama. Professor Turley also testified before the House that President Obama has become the embodiment of the imperial president. Barack Obama has become the president Richard Nixon always wished he could be. Those are the words of a liberal Democratic constitutional law professor who voted for Barack Obama. But my friend, the junior senator from Alabama, is learned and experienced in the ways of the Senate. You have seen lions of the Senate walk this floor. It is unprecedented to have a president so brazenly defy the rule of law, but I'll tell you what is equally unprecedented: to have the Senate lie down and meow like kitty cats. Abuse of power by the president is not a new phenomenon. Presidents of both parties have abused their power. That is a job, sadly, where that tendency has been significant. But in the past, when presidents have abused their power, members of their own party stood up and called them to account for it. When Richard Nixon abused his power, members of both parties rightfully decried his abuse of power, so much so that he was forced to resign. I can tell you, when George W. Bush was president, he signed a 2-paragraph order that purported to order the state courts to obey the World Court. I know this because I was at the time serving as the Solicitor General of Texas, and it was our state courts that the president's order purported to bind. Now, George W. Bush is a good man. He's a former governor of Texas. He's a Republican, and he was a friend, and is a friend. And yet, I was proud that the state of Texas did not hesitate to stand up to that abuse of power. I went before the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of the state of Texas and argued that President George W. Bush's order was unconstitutional, that no president has the authority to give up U.S. sovereignty. And I'm pleased to say the U.S. Supreme Court agreed and struck down the president's order by a vote of 6-3. What is unprecedented today is that on the left side of the chamber, it is both literally and figuratively empty. We had, not too long ago, the president abuse his power with recess appointments. One of the important checks and balances the Constitution creates on presidential authority is it gives this body, the U.S. Senate, the power of confirmation. Well, President Obama apparently didn't like any checks and balances on his power. And so he made a series of recess appointments when the Senate wasn't in recess. It was brazen, it was naked. The president simply asserted, I say the Senate rather is in recess. Mind you, the Senate didn't say we were in recess, but the president claimed the power to declare us in recess when we weren't. And you want to know how extreme that was? You want to know how brazen that was? You want to know how extraordinary that was? Just a few weeks ago, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously struck it down as unconstitutional. Mr. President, it's important to underscore that. There's a lot of coverage in the newspaper that suggests you've got liberal justices and conservative justices, and on any close issues, it's going to be 5-4. This wasn't 5-4. It wasn't 6-3. It wasn't 7-2. It wasn't even 8-1. 9-0. Every Democratic appointee on the court, both of President Obama's appointees on the court, they looked at the substantive issue and said, this ain't hard. The president doesn't get to say when the Senate's in recess. The Senate gets to say when the Senate's in recess. And if the Senate isn't in recess, the president has to respect the checks and balances of confirmation. So you've got an easy, no-brainer layup of a constitutional law question about the president usurping the constitutional prerogatives of the Senate, and how many Senate Democrats stood up to their party's president? Not a single one. Not the majority leader of the Senate, who you might think would have some interest in the institutional credibility of this institution. And I'm sorry to say, not a lone Democratic senator. It wasn't that long ago. There were lions of the Senate on the Democratic side who prided themselves on defending this institution. Robert Byrd, who stood for years defending this institution. Ted Kennedy. And I would say to my friend, the junior senator from Alabama, what is truly unprecedented is that there are no Senate Democrats who say enough is enough. I am hopeful. At some point, you will see a Senate Democrat listen to their constituents, listen to the Constitution, listen to the rule of law. And let me note, by the way, look, I can assume the reason why Senate Democrats don't do it. And by the way, the reason why our friends in the press often don't report on this. I can assume their reasoning goes something like this. Well, I basically agree with the policies of President Obama. I like the policies. I agree with what he's doing. And he's our guy. We kind of got to back our guy. I'm guessing that's a reason, but I will note to you, as the scriptures say, there came a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph and his children. President Barack Obama will not always be president of the United States. There will be another president. And even to my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle, I'm going to say something shocking and terrifying to you. There will come another Republican president. And if the president has the authority to do what President Obama is claiming, with Obamacare 28 times, he simply unilaterally changed the text of the law. Said, it doesn't matter what the law says. I say it's something different. If the president has that power, you know what? A Republican president has that power too. So I would encourage all of my friends on the left who say, I like these policy issues. Well, imagine some of the policy issues you don't like. Whether on labor law or environmental law or tort reform. Or let's take tax law. Let me give you an example. Imagine a subsequent Republican president who stood up and stated quite sensibly the economy would do much better if we moved to a flat tax. So I am therefore instructing the IRS, do not collect any tax above 20%. Now, you might say, well, that sounds extreme. That sounds radical. It's a policy matter. That'd be a terrific policy. But could the president instruct the IRS not to enforce tax laws? Well, Mr. President, 55 members of this body are already on record saying yes. You know why? Because when the president suspended the individual mandate for big business, the text of Obamacare says, the employer mandate for big business, the text of Obamacare says the employer mandate kicked in on January 1st, 2014. The president said, I'm suspending that provision of law. I'm granting my buddies in big business a waiver. That was a tax law.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
I thank Senator from Texas. And I think what he's saying is reflected in what Professor Turley said. It's almost like a plea to his colleagues, maybe his Democratic colleagues, his friends. He said this, the president's pledge to effectively govern alone is alarming, and what is most alarming is his ability to fulfill that pledge. In other words, his ability to get away with it. That Congress acquiesces in it. Let me just say right now, this president is not going to get away with a unilateral amnesty. We're going to take this to the American people, and at some point, this Congress will be held to account. If he does so, every member is going to have to vote and be responsible for allowing the president to run roughshod over the law of this country and the people's representatives, and in effect, the people of the United States. His plan for amnesty, under the circumstances he advocated them, has been rejected. Congress is always available to consider any issue and make any decision it chooses, but it has, under the circumstances driven in this body, it's been rejected. He has no power to go forward and beyond that, and we're going to not allow it to happen. It's wrong. Whether you agree or disagree about how amnesty should be given, it's wrong for the president to unilaterally execute such a policy, as Professor Turley said, and as the senator from Texas has said, the former Solicitor General of the state of Texas, and he understands the law, and this matter is not over. We'll continue to advocate. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.
Oh, thank you. I'm just going to ask that.